Welcome everyone. Very, very warm welcome. Tonight, it's my round. Well, it's a virtual round. Let me just sort that out before we go any further. And it's a brief and entirely sober and somewhat irreverent journey into the world of taverns and alehouses, pubs and inns, hostelries, hotels, and their suppliers, with me, Bill Sadler, your virtual host. Am I a virtual host? Well, yeah, for this presentation. It's a virtual heritage round of brewers, distillers, and purveyors of fine drink in and around Grantown. Now, we have technology as well. In the spirit of a virtual tour, we can journey backwards and forwards through time, visiting people and places, both in the 21st century and in days long past. So, drink up, those of you who've got a glass, save it for later if you haven't, make yourselves comfortable, and come with me. Start in 1755, because that's a lovely date, because that's where the Ballyward Inn started. Now, the Ballyward Inn provides one of my favourite views, looking over the trees in Grantown and over the Cairngorms to the background. It's situated at the top of the Ballyward Brae, and it would have been a stopping point for travellers and a place for meetings. Close to old Grantown, the inn was built on the instructions of Sir Ludovic Grant, and for which he paid £100 to Andrew Frew, the master mason supervising the main extension of Castle Grant at the time. The builder, however, lamented the fact that it cost more than £100, and he was out of pocket. Well, isn't that just the way of drink-related adventures? It was for many years the main inn in Mid-Strathspey, even after the foundation of the new town, and local courts would have been held here. There is an interesting court case, in fact, recorded some 50 years earlier, concerning drink, when 3 women were condemned to be tied to the Regality Cross in Old Grantown, made bare from the belt upwards and scourged, each receiving 30 stripes and then banished from the country. Their crime? Conveying drink to prisoners in ward at Castle Grant, who drank to such excess that they died. In the same year, 4 bailies in Strathspey ordained that only local malt could be used in brewing of aquavita, which should be sold at a reasonable rate and of sufficient stuff. But maybe we could meet Sir Ludovic, as Ballyward Inn was close to Castle Grant, and Ludovic himself could manage to tuck away a considerable quantity of alcohol. Hence, the founder of New Grantown, his son, James Grant of Grant, had an aversion to whisky, the consumption of which he tried very hard to limit. The pernicious custom of drinking spirits, then all too prevalent in the Highlands. The very first inn in Grantown was to have been at the corner of the square, where the Bank of Scotland building is situated. The first innkeepers in 1765, Janet and John Mackenzie, chose, however, a site which is now in Castle Road. Ironically, the building then became a schoolhouse, from which the master very shortly after did a moonlight flitting, having run up too many debts. Later, it was knocked down to be replaced by a police station. The legendary Janet was a distant relative of the laird. She was a character in her own right and described as being like a balloon without the aid of gas or crinoline. Hers is a remarkable story. That too is for another day. She remained in Castle Road less than 2 years before moving to the south side of the square. It was not long, however, before there were so many comments about the disorderly conduct within her house in Grantown that she moved off to set up an inn, firstly at Camdlemore and then Tomintoul. At much the same time, the laird's clerk had a house built at the corner, close to the East End burn. This, much later, became the Garth Hotel. In the meantime, it housed the local doctors, the minister, and many summer guests, including Marie Corelli, who was Queen Victoria's favourite author. Whilst here, we might just take a nip down to the Dunvegan Hotel. Specially built as a hotel in the 1930s by D.D. Smith the plumber, it was said to be the only new purpose-built hotel ever in Grantown. It became a hospital for troops returning after Dunkirk. It then lay vacant for quite some time until sold at a roup. It was later described as ideally situated, overlooking the sporting 18th golf course and also the tennis courts, bowling and putting greens in the 1960s, as well as such luxuries as central heating, a television lounge, as well as skiing from Christmas to Easter. And then, from there, on to the golf course, to the clubhouse, dating back to 1890 for perhaps a practice round, and another splendid view from the terrace overlooking the woods and the Cromdale Hills. It was the venue for the original Grantown Hickory Club Challenge in 2015, and on occasion skiing, but not from Christmas to Easter. Back to the square and the legendary Waterford, now apartments. It was built as a house on the site of Janet Mackenzie's raucous establishment. Many will remember those Saturday nights in the Waterford, where the young folk gathered for a night of music and dance. Dinner dances were famous, and it's perhaps the only hotel for miles around, if indeed anywhere, where the price was negotiated inversely. Jimmy Calder might say, "We'll do that for £3 a head." "That's ridiculous, Jimmy. It should be more like 6. "Well, we could make it 4. "That's very generous. How about a £5 a head?" And so it was. Grantown's foremost hotel, the prestigious 4-star Grant Arms, was the subject of a Grantown Society costume drama one year, and starred Edmund Burke, the Reverend James Hall and John Grant, Robert Burns, Robert Southey, Thomas Temford, Police Constable James Fraser, who was murdered on the stage, and Queen Victoria, to say nothing of a string of owners, managers, bar staff and other hotel workers. It was Robert Southey who described the owners as foolish people who had wasted their money on expensive furniture, the house not being better than a village alehouse and run by a vulgar woman from Portsmouth. Nobody from Portsmouth, is there? But we might think little of the judgment of Southey, who described Grantown as being duller than Rothes. Well, James Grant of Grant, as was said earlier, was not in favour of strong liquor. Hence he encouraged the establishment of a brewing, bakery and butcher meat co-partnery to be set up in what became the Grant Arms. Frequently he tried to call time on excessive sales of whisky and unlicensed brewing. The new business was to have a monopoly on the making of ale, for the consumption at fairs, for workmen out of doors, and for supply to the inns. The tenementers, when signing their leases, agreed that neither they nor their heirs would brew or sell ale or liquor without special permission. In 1784, 45 householders were found to be breaking the lease agreements, and these included his own piper, the postmaster, the schoolmaster, the baker, grocer, and several others. 2 were charged and heavily fined to such an extent that they had to sell their businesses. And in his own establishment, the brewery, the cellars were not confined to vats of nappy ale, but casks of genuine Glenlivet and Stratharn's Ushka Bay. It was the view of Congrish's nephew, W.G. Stewart, in 1860, that the native brew of the good Sir James' time was a beverage surpassing the produce of modern breweries in strength, pleasant flavour, and taste. Stepping out of the hotel into the square, where at one time drinking in public was banned. Oh, and maybe we should gloss over the New Year's shinty matches, which took place there, or feeing markets with public houses and a tent selling beer and whiskey. When the market was over, it was recalled some years later, many could be seen staggering along the streets, completely under the influence. Maybe we should note Robert Burns' advice about taking heed whene'er to drink you are inclined, or Cutty Sark's run in your mind. In which case, there was a temperance hotel nearby. And if that's not entirely legible, it suggests that the temperance worker paying a surprise visit said, does Mr. Murdoch live here? His wife replied, aye, carry him in. And we could, of course, drop into the Legion at a time, or at least a year, to suit your mode of dress. Through time, there's been no shortage of licensed grocers in the square. In 1860, you could choose from grocers and wine and spirits merchants, Cumming and MacDougall, John Gordon or Isabella MacDonald, and now from the Co-op, the Premier, or previously Cameron Grant, Catanox and Spar. The Spar was where 1 year in the store not so long ago it was so cold that the sound of popping corks was none other than the frozen bottles exploding. Across the road is the Rose Hall, originally 2 houses with an outside stair. As a hotel, there would be a warm welcome, and some may recall Viv McLennan, and it was at one time even had Grantown's nightclub. Now it provides a base for parklands and care of a different kind. Perhaps around 1906, we could pop into this building, just along the square from Rose Hall, though I suspect scant the dram you would have got there at the time. It was the offices of the Parish Council and the Inspector of Poor. But how many of you, however, have failed to notice the evidence still on the wall of a later business more appropriate to our journey? By 1938, we could have dropped in for afternoon tea or a drink to Mackay's Hotel, a popular destination in the square. And from there, we'll go along Seafield Avenue back to 1894 and past the Manse, now Ravenscourt, where in 1965 a room and breakfast for 2 could have set you back £2, and morning tea 2 shillings. And then on to number 1, the road from Grantown to Dreggy, built for George Anderson, ironmonger, the square, Gordon Hall, as it was named, and it was let as soon as it was completed, and had, according to that year's letting lists, 3 public, 9 bedrooms, kitchen, 2 servants' bedrooms, 4 beds, servants' hall, large kitchen, butler's pantry and scullery, a large wine cellar, bathroom, 2 linen closets, storeroom, meat safe and washhouse, and 3 WCs. The washhouse, pantries and sculleries have hot and cold water tubs. There are tennis and croquet greens, etc. However, all of this was not enough for one American millionaire, and the West Wing was added with another 3 public and 13 bedrooms. And yes, some of you may well recall that as the Spey Valley Hotel. Now, the secret of good whisky is good water, and of that Grantown has plenty, notably that copious and pure spring which fed Grantown's first piped water supply, somewhere in Dulig, not far from this little bridge over the road to Gorton, and there was Grantown's distillery. The evidence for this comes from early 19th century letters On the 18th of June 1836, for example, Captain John Grant, Congash, wrote to John Fraser about the distillery under construction at the Dulig. And on the 24th of June of that year, A. Faulkner wrote to John Fraser about a distillery near Grantown, the building being nearly completed. There's no evidence, however, that it ever came into production. Of the water here, however, a few lines of doggerel published in the Strathspey News in December 1929 includes the lines, "The mineral water is sweet as honey. You can take a drink and it costs no money." Very true. And so, back to the High Street and the Grand View. Formerly a long-established hotel. And with any such hotel there are many stories. And the following was told at a society presentation entitled Close Encounters. There was a close situated where the front door is now. The building on the right was the Old Palace Hotel, or the Black Bull, and on the left the painter and photographer's Castle Urquhart, later the shop of Beal and Piper. The close led to the stables and byres and the pigsties. There's a story told by Annie Grant in one of the school magazines referring to these palatial buildings. And she wrote, "One day a week we had sewing from 3 to 4 o'clock, and a few of us braves thought it would be a great adventure to slip sewing. Passing the outer door, we made a dash for the dyke, and on hands and knees crept out at the gate. To go home was impossible. The wrath and horror of parents could not be faced, so this precious and stolen hour was spent most enjoyably by the pigsty in the Palace Hotel yard. And the aftermath I'll leave you to guess." It was from this yard that one day one of the hotel cows, looking for a change of scene, walked unnoticed through a side door of the hotel. She looked at the bar, decided she didn't like it, and took up residence in the front hall. Not until she had well and truly left her trademarks on the floor could Mr. Hastelow and his staff persuade her to go. Making a more dignified exit from the yard would be the Palace horse bus, running to and from the station. Mail was carried as well as passengers. The fare was 6pence. The driver sat high on top of the bus, and there are many tales to tell of these men. That too must wait for another day. And dignified exits, of course, come in all manner of styles. Leaving the palace yards and gardens, we could have come to Woodside Avenue. Now it's 1898, and Grantown has become a borough. Not a borough of regality this time, but a police borough. Will that make any difference to our drinking customs? Here we are at Seafield Lodge, and we can ask the Provost himself, Andrew Macpherson Grant. He certainly had to preside over many stormy meetings of the new council. But let's continue to the Craig. Craigravac originally, Laburnum, a single-storey cottage dated 1868, but sold a year later in a public rout for £167. Time perhaps for a pie and a pint, contesting the top spot in Grantown's TripAdvisor as their foremost attraction, before we head back to the High Street. Again, through the ages, names of wine merchants and licensed grocers would have been familiar. The restaurant, now the Wee Puffin, was Victoria Wines, previously Alex Murdo, and once J. Grant, wine merchant, then David Strachan's. One of their account books tells us that on August 29, 1941, 9 shillings was paid for a half bottle of whisky and 8 shillings for a dozen bottles of beer. Again, what secrets these books would have to tell, and what stories they could share, and what names. These stories are our history and heritage, and need to be recorded and kept. And so, once more, Grantown potentially has its own brewery. And what a special display they made one Christmas. Roll on opening time. Because this is a special virtual round of establishments, old and new, we could arrive 100 years at our next venue in style. Next to the Benmore, but Grant's, not to the Benmore, but Grant's Temperance Hotel, disputing the Dunvegan's claim to be the only purpose-built hotel in town. So, yet again, every step another story, and sometimes quite a surprising one. Every stop another tune, from Alfie's Karaoke to Fiddler Strathspey music sessions. On the corner of the High Street and Spey Avenue, Dunbar's Hotel, one of Grantown's oldest, another lost treasure for the drinking public, as they stand here, waiting, obviously, to cross the road, but the traffic lights are not yet installed. Let's take a step now to number 1 North Street East, to the Cop. Not to replay some of Liverpool's famous victories, nor to the British Empire's fatal defeat near Ladysmith in South Africa. We shall go to what was known as Spion-Cope. The Coppice, now again under a new name and new management. Whilst there are too many stories to tell for just one round of drinks, we do find that many share the same characters. The Coppice started life under a very different name, as we said, Spion-Cope. The plans were passed in February 1899 for a house on this site. It was in the name of Jane Grant, none other than the daughter of Alexander Grant of Galloway and the wife of Andrew Macpherson Grant, the first provost. Another hotel, which has recently changed hands, was originally 3 separate villas, numbers 2, 3 and 4 Station Road. The first of which was Westwood on the corner, built for Mrs. Jessie Sim in 1891, with the stipulation that it was to cost more than £1,000 and to be completed within 12 months. It was Mrs. Mackay who bought the first villa, Craiglin, and later the adjacent villas and also Braemurray. The fields in front and behind were used as farmland with hayfields, cows, hens, turkeys and pigs. The architectural feat of Harry Fraser in joining Craiglin with Enfield is notable, unlike the latter link with Westwood, though the major fire of 1962 had an effect on that. Many will remember the hall to the rear of the building, popular for social and sporting events. And if you can picture the hotel, you can picture those turrets joining the 2 villas, perhaps without even realising that there were 2 separate houses, and then the wooden bit which joins on to the next one. The Craiglin was the starting point for the Society's first dramatic pub crawl in 2007. The earlier original version of the walk itself was on a Sunday afternoon and written as a fundraising event as part of the Macmillan Mile project. The 2007 version offered drinks all round in the Craiglin, and we told tales of the war through the eyes of the staff and sang choruses of wartime favourites. And there has been a request that we run another dramatic pub crawl sometime in the very near future. And you've seen 1 or 2 pictures as we go along. The start of the distilling story goes back into the mists of time, though the first written reference I have to whisky in Scotland is the 1494 Scottish Exchequer Rolls. Production then was very much described as a back kitchen affair made for domestic consumption, a savage dram from malted barley in crude pot stills. In 1751, one of the Seafield papers records the long use of spirituous liquors has been reckoned cherishing and in some degree necessary. Perhaps in regard to the latter, one might think of the men who had to repair the main bridge of the Bridge of Spey, waist deep in icy water during the winter of 1768, or the men who floated timber down the river to Garmouth, fortified by frequent large measures of whisky. As duty was imposed on whisky and successively increased, illicit distillation and the avoidance of duty became a matter of routine, if not a matter of principle. This sma still was on display in the Courthouse Museum and came from Achindun, where it had produced high-quality spirit for many years, and there are many stories of illicit distillation and smuggling. One such tale is told by Alex Cumming in his book on the Braes. About 1800, there are at least 3 sma stills in full working order in the Braes. It was necessary, of course, to keep a keen lookout for the gauger, or exciseman, and on his appearance at Glasscoil at Garthtine, a prearranged signal, usually a sheet hung out, was given to warn the Braes folk of his proximity. On one occasion, 2 gaugers avoided the vigilance of the watchers and appeared at a most inappropriate moment at a house in the Braes. Detection and capture seemed imminent, for there was much incriminating evidence in sight. But a quick-witted youth saved the situation. Flinging an empty keg on his shoulder, he dashed out just as the gaugers were approaching the door. Only when he had led them a safe distance from the house did he allow his pursuers to capture himself and the precious keg. Naturally, on returning to the house, nothing in the slightest degree suspicious was there to be seen. The story of the legislation of the trade in this area comes very largely from Balmenich, to where in the early years of the 19th century James MacGregor had moved from Tomintoul. The story is related by Sir Robert Bruce Lockhart. Beside the arduous task of creating this farm, MacGregor continued the more profitable sideline of illicit distilling. Soon after the passing of the Act of 1823, he received a visit from the nearest excise officer. Their talk was friendly and began with a generous dram of pure malt. When these preliminaries were finished to the satisfaction of both men, the excise officer mentioned shyly that he had his duty to perform and had better have a look around. So out went the 2 men to inspect the farm. Finally they came to a rough stone building with a mill wheel and a mill laid by its side. "Oh, what'll that be?" says the excise officer. "Oh, that's just the peat shed," was the reply, and nothing more was said, and the 2 men went back to the house for another dram and a talk about the crops and the prospects of the harvest. Then, as the gauger took his leave, he said quietly, "If I were you, Mr. MacGregor, I'd take out a licence for yon peat shed." And so started one of the earliest licensed distilleries in the Highlands, an honour shared with George Smith of Glenlivet, the owner of Mortlach, and one Mrs. Gordon, of whom we shall hear more later. It wouldn't make sense to talk about brewing and distilling without taking a walk beyond the borough boundary and visiting the new Gordon MacPhail distillery at Lower Gaich. I'm afraid, though, that you'll have to wait 10 or 12 years into the future to have a dram there of the new Cairn whisky. 3 years is the legal minimum before whisky can be sold. Despite being in Strathspey, a geographic description which is very important to us in Grantown, after all, we are the capital of Strathspey, the new drink will no doubt be marketed as a Speyside whisky. Not far from the cairn is the site of a distillery once situated at Old Ballintom on the western snout of the ridge, and where rest the ancient standing stones. The distillery was first mentioned in 1824 with an application for a licence by a Mrs. Gordon. John Fraser's Cullen House Letter Book, 1823-26, makes reference to a distillery there. It had been in production for several years before Donald Gordon Ballintom wrote on the 15th of November 1851 to the factor of Strathspey about the Ballintom distillery, and there was noted a proposal 2 years later that Mrs. Gordon Ballintom of taking the distillery across to Ochernach. Although apparently perceived as a good idea, there's no evidence that this ever took place. Mrs. Anne Gordon, incidentally, was a relative of Captain John Grant Congash. It helps, you know. The distillery is mentioned in several directories through to the 1860s, but on the Ordnance Survey map of 1868 it is marked as an empty building, which may indicate by this time it had ceased business. More recently, there were indeed plans for another distillery there in the old Ballintom farm buildings, but it appears to have come to naught. This area of Strathspey is one of the most important historic sites in the whole valley of the Spey. It was the gathering point for the Clan Grant, and here on Tom na Croich in the 17th century was a gallows. Sorry. That's what I need is one of these, obviously. Medicinal only. It's a prop. It's not angel's nectar. It was here, under the watchful eye of Laird Ludovic Grant, 8th of Fruchi, that Alan Cameron for Neargate was hanged for murder, unbeknown to his mother, who was spinning flax not very far away. Sir Ludovic, impatient of the convict's last remarks, allegedly demanded between mouthfuls of the lunch he was eating, "Knock him off. He has confessed enough." The story, of course, started long before then with a quarrel in an inn not far from Ballintom. And our final stop is at that very inn, not far from Inverallen Graveyard and close to Figgott's Well, and at one time the site of Figgot Fair. Of the inn now nothing remains but its legend and the stories. The chronicler of the hanging of Alan Cameron commented on St. Figgot that the shrine of the saint had reached the last stage of sanctity and become transformed into an alehouse. And with that final irreverent comment, I take my leave. I do hope you've had an enjoyable journey and perhaps enjoyed or will enjoy a pleasant drink on the way. And there I end my round trip